French involvement in the American Revolution. The involvement of France in the American War of Independence, 1775-1783, was not only significant in the progress of the war itself, but also as a critical moment for France. Whereas French intervention in the war would help turn the tide in favor of the Americans, the debt it incurred would contribute to the later French Revolution, 1789-1799. Tensions between France and Great Britain had existed for centuries and had only been exacerbated by the recent humiliating defeat of France in the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763. A rise in pro-American sentiment combined with nostalgia for the great heroes of French history contributed to the French public's desire for war, while the government of King Louis XVI, 1774-1792, saw the war as an ideal way to regain some of the prestige and power lost after France's defeat. The victory of France and its American allies, solidified with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, reaffirmed France's status as a great military power and saw the independence of the United States. France's involvement heavily damaged its finances, however, a problem that its government proved incapable of solving. Issues that arose from this debt, combined with continued state spending, were some of the most immediate causes of the French Revolution and the toppling of France's Ancien Regime. Patriots and politics. The conclusion of the 7 Years' War in 1763 would have long-reaching ramifications, the ripples of which would affect the rest of the 18th century and, indeed, the course of world history. One of these effects could be seen in the culmination of debt incurred by the British government during the course of winning the war. To pay off this debt, the British Parliament levied a number of different taxes against its 13 American colonies during the rest of the 1760s and early 1770s. Part of Parliament's rationale in these taxes was that the war had begun in defense of these colonies, who should be made to help pay for its outcome. Resistance of the American populace, particularly its landowning class, to these taxes was a major contributing factor to the outbreak of the American War of Independence in 1775. A second effect of the end of the 7 Years' War could be seen in France, the vanquished nation. The Peace of 1763 had stripped France of much of its North American colonial possessions, most significantly the colony of Canada. Ceding Canada to Britain was not too great of a loss, as the colony had become something of a financial burden in recent years, but the damage to France's status and prestige as a great power was a problem. The 7 Years' War had been but the latest conflict in a string of wars fought between France and Britain, stretching all the way back to 1689, a series of conflicts referred to by some modern historians as the Second 100 Years' War, 1689-1815. As such, the defeat of France by Britain was especially embarrassing, and many French officials soon started looking for an excuse to get revenge on Britain. With the ascension of Louis XVI, ruler 1754-1793, to the French throne in 1774, this excuse seemed just on the horizon. Tensions between Britain and its 13 colonies were almost at their boiling point, and many of Louis's ministers wanted in on the coming action. In 1776, as the outbreak of hostilities led to the colonies declaring their independence, the Comte de Vergennes, 1719-1787, France's foreign secretary, declared that Providence has marked out this moment for the humiliation of England, and worked to persuade the new king, inexperienced and only 22 years old, to intervene. Although the argument could be made that the hawkish inclinations of men like Vergennes came from a dispassionate, calculated bid for power, the same could not be said for the French populace, many of whom genuinely supported the aims of the American Revolution and desired vengeance against Britain. Many in French aristocratic circles had already viewed America through a romanticized lens, seeing it as a renewed society separated from the cynicism and frailty of the old world, its settlers possessing the much-admired traits of innocence and freedom. The commitments to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness put forth by Thomas Jefferson, L. 1743-1826, in the Declaration of Independence, spoke to the similar Enlightenment ideals that had become so popular in France. American leaders such as George Washington, L. 1732-1799, were much admired amongst the French, but perhaps no American was as famed as America's ambassador to France, Benjamin Franklin, L. 1706-1790. Playing into the French stereotype that the New World was a place of freedom and innocence, Franklin wore an unostentatious brown coat to court audiences and started to wear a beaver cap. Aware of the hunger for scientific learning amongst the French elite, Franklin leaned into his reputation as a scientific mind, and soon enough his journal, Poor Richard's Almanac, was being translated into French. Franklin's image as the enlightened, educated, and unpretentious American gave the French public exactly what they wanted. At the height of Franklin's celebrity, he could not leave his Paris home without being swarmed by adoring fans, and his likeness, appearing on dolls, snuff boxes, and inkwells, was for a time more recognizable than the king's. As the War for Independence began, the French began showing their support with engravings commemorating American victories over the British, while French socialites soon began fetishizing the number 13 in solidarity with the 13 colonies. They would meet in groups of 13, each individual wearing an emblem of one of the 13 colonies before drinking 13 toasts to an American victory. Popular support for the war in France came from a resurgence in its own patriotism. Many in France dealt with the defeat in 1763 by looking nostalgically back to historical French heroes. Figures such as Henry IV of France, R. 1589-1610, and Joan of Arc, 1412-1431, were favorites, along with more recent heroes such as the Marquis de Montcalm, 1712-1759, who had sacrificed his life fighting the hated British. In the words of scholar Seaman Chama, the publication of a historical anthology, the Portrait des Grands Hommes Illustres de la France, which celebrated such figures, created a new, exclusively French pantheon of heroes, Chama, 32. Rising patriotism and anti-British feeling could also be seen on stage. Dramatist Pierre de Belloy's 1765 play, The Siege of Calais, depicted French martyrs sacrificing their lives to the wrath of the invading English. This play, casting the English as villains, was immensely popular, attracting 19,000 spectators during its first run. Despite this fervor for action both by French ministers like Vergennes and the general public, there were still those who thought intervention to be a bad idea. Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, the French Controller General, was aware of the burden of debt brought about by France's previous wars and predicted that France could not financially handle another war. In 1776, Turgot denounced Vergennes' planned involvement in America, warning that such a war would permanently destroy any hope of financial reform, predicting that the first gunshot will drive the state to bankruptcy. Doyle, 66. Turgot's rather prophetic warnings fell on deaf ears, and he was fired in May 1776, aiding the Americans. In 1776, the governing body of the 13 colonies, the Continental Congress, sent Connecticut lawyer Silas Deane to Paris, tasking him with negotiating French support. Deane met with Vergennes, telling him that the Americans had enough men to beat the British in theory, but they required ammunition, arms, and money. Seeing this as a relatively low-cost way to fight the British, Vergennes established a private trading company to secretly funnel uniforms, ammunition, and surplus French arms left over from the 7 Years' War to the Americans, in exchange for American products such as tobacco, cotton, and whale oil. When the Americans under George Washington suffered setbacks at the Battle of Long Island, Congress realized this aid was insufficient and sent Deane back to Vergennes to negotiate a more substantial French alliance. Unable to commit to outright war with Britain, Vergennes agreed to send French officers to train American troops in exchange for these officers to be given high positions in the Continental Army and for a French generalissimo to replace Washington at its head. The man Vergennes had in mind for such a command was Victor Francois, 2nd Duc de Broglie, who was ordered to come up with a list of officers to present to Deane for consideration in the Continental Army. One of the officers recommended to Deane by de Broglie was a young, ambitious aristocrat, Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, d'Albe, 1757-1834. Vergennes' clandestine scheme to aid the Americans was at first opposed by Louis XVI, who, remembering Turgot's warning, was still reluctant to provoke war with Britain. Vergennes argued that it was France's duty to defeat Britain at all costs, reminding the king that England is the natural enemy of France. The invariable and most cherished purpose in her politics has been, if not the destruction of France, at least her overthrow, her humiliation, her ruin. All means to reduce the power and greatness of England are just, legitimate, and even necessary. The king was persuaded by his minister's words and changed course, approving the scheme, but Vergennes' plan would soon be thwarted when it was discovered by British agents. When threatened with war should the French officers be allowed to depart for the Americas, Louis XVI backed down. Despite the king's subsequent decree forbidding any French officer from adventuring in the Americas on penalty of imprisonment, Lafayette sneaked out of France aboard the ship Victoire. Upon arriving in the colonies, Lafayette was given the rank of Major General in the Continental Army, achieving fame through his battlefield exploits and becoming one of Washington's right-hand men. Other French officers would follow suit, although Vergennes' plot to replace Washington with de Broglie would ultimately never materialize, as Washington quickly regained his popularity. The heroics of Lafayette, the public desire for war, and the persuasion of men like Franklin and Vergennes soon pushed Louis XVI closer to favoring war. When news came of the Americans' astounding victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, a renewed enthusiasm for the American Revolution swelled in France, and Louis finally gave Vergennes permission to negotiate a military alliance with the Americans. The Bourbon War. Having finally achieved his goal of embroiling France in the American War, Vergennes sprung to action. On 6 February 1778, France recognized the independence of the United States and entered a treaty of alliance with it. Crafting an alliance with the Spanish Bourbons and the Dutch Republic, Vergennes presented Britain as an aggressor, declaring that this new coalition was only intervening to preserve the Americans' independence. By March, France and Britain were officially at war. Although part of the American War for Independence, the specific conflict between Britain and France during this time also became known as the Anglo-French War of 1778, or alternatively, as the Bourbon War. The early years of France's involvement in the war proved unsuccessful. A fleet commanded by the Comte d'Estaing arrived off British-controlled New York in summer 1778, but was unable to enter the harbor and attack the city. D'Estaing then sailed toward Newport, Rhode Island, hoping to combine with the Americans and take the city. The attack failed due to a combination of poor weather and the lack of cooperation between French and American soldiers. D'Estaing returned the next year, this time moving against British-controlled Savannah, Georgia. After an unsuccessful naval bombardment, D'Estaing launched a ground assault, which also was repelled. The same year, the planned invasion of mainland Britain, involving a 30,000-man army commanded by Lafayette, that was to be ferried across the English Channel by an armada of Spanish ships, was foiled by the outbreak of smallpox amongst the Spanish crews, stormy weather, and a British flotilla that moved to guard the Channel. The situation improved markedly in 1780, when 6,000 French soldiers under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau landed in Rhode Island. Unlike D'Estaing, who refused to take orders from the Americans on account of his nobility, Rochambeau put his aristocratic feelings aside and deferred to the command of General Washington. After an American army under the command of Lafayette trapped a larger British army in the port village of Yorktown, Washington and Rochambeau worked together to press their advantage. While Washington moved in by land to reinforce Lafayette, a French navy cut the British off by the sea. The surrender of this British army in October 1781 was the decisive moment that effectively brought the war in North America to an end. The North American theater proved to be one of many, however, as the entry of France, Spain, and the Netherlands enlarged the war to a global scale. On 24th of June 1779, the combined Bourbon armies of France and Spain besieged the British at Gibraltar. The siege would continue long after the North American theater was decided at Yorktown, with the final large-scale assault on Gibraltar not coming until September 1782. The siege was not lifted until February 1783. The war was also carried into the Caribbean and into India, where the two great powers still had colonies. Following the victory at Yorktown, the French Navy captured Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, and Tobago in the West Indies, before finally being stopped by a British fleet at the Battle of the Sant in April 1782. This naval battle was considered Britain's greatest victory over the French during the war. In India, the conflict between Britain and France caused the British to go after France's ally, the Kingdom of Mysore, sparking the Second Anglo-Mysore War in 1778. The Siege of Cuddalore, beginning in July 1783, was one of the last actions of the war and ended only when preliminary talks of peace were announced. As the conflict dragged on in many different parts of the world, the need for more funds grew increasingly vital. It fell to Jacques Necker, les 1732-1804, a Genevan banker who had been named Louis XVI's Director of the Treasury in 1776 to procure these funds. Determined not to increase taxes, Necker financed France's intervention in the war through loans. Between 1777 and his resignation in 1781, Necker raised 520 million livres in loans, piling even more debt on a state that already had debt in abundance. After his resignation, his successor, Joly de Fleury, felt obliged to raise the taxes and raise 232 million more livres. By the end of the war in September 1783, France had spent over 1.6 billion livres fighting the British. Aftermath. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 did not see any of the lands taken in the 1763 peace returned to France. All territories captured in the War of Independence were returned to their original owners, with the exception of Tobago and part of the Senegal River area, which France kept. Spain regained Florida and Minorca, although Gibraltar remained under British control. The United States, of course, had their independence recognized and officially became a nation. For all intents and purposes, it appeared that France had achieved everything it had set out to do. It had both embarrassed Britain and deprived it of the 13 colonies, while simultaneously regaining its status as a formidable power. King Louis XVII, impressed with the performance of the French Navy during the war, continued the financing of the military port at Cherbourg, which could theoretically provide a base for a future invasion of Britain. This would prove an expensive endeavor that would amount to very little payoff. Regarding France itself, the legacy of its intervention in the American Revolutionary War was one of massive debt. Necker's policy of not raising taxes may have endeared him to the public, but it did nothing to alleviate the state's financial burden. In fact, Necker had gone so far as to publish an account of France's finances in February 1781, known as the Compte Rendu au Roi, Report to the King, in which he reported that ordinary revenues were exceeding expenditure by over 10 million livres. However, Necker's report did not include the extraordinary accounts, which contained the real cost of the war. Had this figure been published, it would have shown France in a significant deficit. The American Revolution also continued to endear itself in the minds of members of the French public. Many in France still saw the revolution as a manifestation of Enlightenment ideals. Patriotism in France had already been on the rise before the American Revolution, but the success of such an enterprise came as proof that change was indeed possible. Without French support, it is doubtful that the Americans could have prevailed against Britain. Yet the impacts of the war on France were almost entirely negative. Despite regaining some prestige and glory, France did not weaken Britain nearly as much as it had wanted to, and put itself over 1 billion livres deeper in debt than it previously had been. The war and the spending that accompanied it would prove to be fatal to the French monarchy. Less than 6 years after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the continual downward spiral of French finances would lead to the beginning of the French Revolution. Women in the American Revolution. In colonial America, women were discouraged from taking an interest in politics and were instead expected to focus only on traditionally feminine matters, such as homemaking and child-rearing. However, such gender roles were challenged during the American Revolution, 1765-1789, when women played a crucial role in achieving the independence of the United States. From the very first signs of tension between the 13 colonies and Great Britain, colonial women discovered their political voice. Women were the driving force behind boycotts of British imports, shunning British tea in favor of local herbal substitutes, and holding spinning bees to reduce dependence on British cloth. Female writers, such as Mercy Otis Warren and Phyllis Wheatley, helped turn public opinion against British rule, while hundreds of women accompanied the Continental Army to perform essential duties like washing, nursing, and cooking. Some women, like Margaret Corbin, Mary Ludwig Hayes, and Deborah Sampson, even took up arms and fought against the British. Although women were not viewed as politically equal to men after the war, their involvement proved to be a vital first step in the long struggle for women's rights in the United States. Role of women in colonial America. In October 1608, the second supply of English settlers arrived at the Jamestown colony of Virginia to supplement the population of original settlers. Among these new arrivals was Thomas Forrest, a gentleman financier, who was accompanied by his wife, a woman listed in the ship's manifest only as Mistress Forrest, and her maid, Anne Burris. Mistress Forrest and Anne Burris were the first two English women to settle in Jamestown. Burris would marry later that year and earn the additional distinction of becoming the first English woman to give birth in Virginia. English women continued to sporadically arrive in Jamestown over the course of the next decade until 1619, when the Virginia Company decided to send large groups of women to foster a self-sustaining population. In 1620, 90 single women, many of them from poor families, arrived in Virginia as the first of the so-called Jamestown brides, or tobacco brides. They were married off to Jamestown's male settlers, each of whom paid the Virginia Company a dowry of 150 pounds of tobacco. Additional groups of Jamestown brides continued to arrive in the following years. Faced with this growing population of women, the colonists of Jamestown implemented a gender hierarchy similar to that which existed in England. This revolved around the doctrine of coverture, which stipulated that once a woman was married, she was under the complete authority of her husband and no longer enjoyed an independent legal status. A married woman, or femme covert, was legally considered to be one with her husband. She could no longer own property or sign contracts, and any money she earned belonged to her husband. Once a woman married, she was usually confined to the role of homemaker, devoting her hours to cleaning, cooking, ironing, sewing, and gardening. Divorce was difficult to obtain and was often only permissible if a pre-existing condition rendered the initial marriage invalid. As a result, many colonial women felt anxiety about marriage, with one woman referring to marriage as a dark leap from the familiarity of her parents' house into an unknown future controlled by a man whose personality she may have misjudged. Still, married life was more desirable than remaining a single woman, or femme soul, for too long, as spinsters were often placed near the bottom of the social hierarchy. Of course, the status of colonial women varied from colony to colony and widely depended on social class. Wealthy women, for instance, were usually better educated than lower-class women, as were women from Puritan New England, who were often taught how to read in order to study the Bible. But, by and large, women were expected to remain within the feminine sphere and to display only feminine traits such as modesty, cheerfulness, patience, and chastity. They were discouraged from expressing any interest in subjects that were considered masculine, particularly politics. Attempts by colonial women to involve themselves in politics were met with punishment, as was the case with Anne Hutchinson, who was banished from Massachusetts in 1637 after challenging the authority of male religious leaders. But as historian Mary Beth Norton points out, the advent of the American Revolution lent colonial women a political voice for the first time, helping to spark the slow progression of women's rights in the U.S. Political involvement of women. In the 1760s, tensions between the 13 colonies and Great Britain began to rise when Parliament passed a series of tax policies that many colonists condemned as unconstitutional. After protests against the Stamp Act, 1765, and Townshend Acts, 1767-68, turned riotous, Parliament dispatched soldiers to colonial cities such as Boston to restore royal authority, which only further escalated the conflict. Despite the notion of politics as an unwomanly activity, letters and diary entries from the period prove that colonial women were just as invested in these political developments as the men. Women were, after all, equally as affected by the parliamentary taxes as the men, and were just as outraged by the occupation of Boston by British soldiers. Many patriot-aligned women threw off conventional gender norms to protest these policies. They marched alongside men in demonstrations, harassed loyalists and tax officials, and seized goods from merchants who were believed to be hoarders. Colonial women were also the driving force in the boycott of British goods. In response to the Tea Act of 1773, many women stopped purchasing tea imported by the British East India Company and refused to serve it to their husbands. Instead, they started to rely on local herbal teas and coffee. Women from all over Boston publicly swore to abstain from drinking British tea to save this abused country from ruin and slavery. On 25 October 1774, a group of 51 women met at the home of Elizabeth King in Edenton, North Carolina, to sign an agreement to boycott all British imports for the public good. This event, known as the Edenton Tea Party, was one of the first organized political actions undertaken by women in U.S. history. Another way women supported the boycott of British goods was to hold spinning bees. Since most clothing was made from British imported cloth, patriot women decided to reduce dependence on Britain by spinning cloth themselves. Spinning bees would begin early in the morning, with a group of 20 to 40 women gathering at the home of their local minister. They would spend the day spinning cloth while discussing politics or engaging in friendly competition with one another. Then, at nightfall, they would disperse after a relevant sermon from the minister. Many such spinning bees were organized by the Daughters of Liberty, a group of politically active women that had been founded in Boston in 1766. Alongside popularizing the boycotts, the Daughters of Liberty was also hands-on in political protests. One of the group's founding members, Sarah Bradley Fulton, came up with the idea of disguising the Sons of Liberty as Mohawks during the Boston Tea Party to conceal their identities from British officials. After the 342 crates of tea had been dumped into Boston Harbor, Fulton hid some of the perpetrators in her home and removed their face paint. For this, she has been referred to as the mother of the Boston Tea Party. While Fulton was on the front lines of patriotic protest, other women fanned the revolutionary flames with pen and paper. Mercy Otis Warren, for instance, was a New England playwright who wrote multiple satires lambasting the Loyalists and encouraging the Patriots. Another example was Phyllis Wheatley, an African woman who was enslaved in Boston, who wrote multiple poems celebrating the American Revolution as well as its leaders. The works of Warren and Wheatley were immensely popular and helped shift public opinion in favor of the Patriots. Despite the usual rigidity of gender roles in colonial America, male revolutionary leaders encouraged female involvement, as the issue was considered too important to count women out. Pamphlets and broadsides encouraged women to continue boycotting British goods, with Samuel Adams even stating, "With ladies on our side, we can make every Tory tremble." Women and the war. As war with Britain loomed on the horizon, patriot women helped prepare for combat. In September 1774, Massachusetts women worked to make food and gather supplies for men in the militias. One observer remembered seeing women and children making cartridges, running bullets, while crying and bemoaning, and at the same time animating their husbands and sons to fight for their liberties, though not knowing whether they should ever see them again. Many women were just as eager for war as the men. The Baroness de Riedzel, wife of a Hessian general, recorded in her diary that she heard an American girl exclaim, "Oh, if I only had the King of England here, with what satisfaction I could cut his body in pieces, tear out his heart, dissect it, put it upon these coals, and consume it." The violence and blatant politicalness of the girl's statement shocked the German Baroness. When the war finally came in April 1775, many women took to accompanying the Continental Army. Most 18th century armies traveled with women, known as camp followers, who would perform essential duties as washerwomen, seamstresses, nurses, and cooks. These camp followers had to put up with the conditions of life in the army camp, which were often miserable, and they had to endure the scorn of the American officers, many of whom viewed them as little more than nuisances. But there were several reasons why women might choose to become camp followers despite these hardships. Some were driven by a sense of patriotism or by a love for their husbands and sons, whom they were loath to part from. Others were unable to support themselves and chose to accompany the army rather than risk starvation and poverty. Some women, like Martha Washington, did not stay with the army all the time, but periodically visited to support their husbands during winter encampments. Though women were considered non-combatants, several patriot women wound up bearing arms against the British. Margaret Corbin, for example, accompanied the Continental Army as the wife of an artilleryman, John Corbin. When John was killed at the Battle of Fort Washington, 16th of November 1776, Margaret took his place and continued to fire his cannon until she was incapacitated by several wounds. She survived the battle and would go on to become the first woman to receive a U.S. military pension. 2 years later, Mary Ludwig Hayes was serving as a water carrier during the scorching hot Battle of Monmouth, 28th June 1778, running back and forth to deliver water to dehydrated soldiers. When her husband, also an artilleryman, passed out from heat exhaustion, Hayes did not hesitate to take his place, firing his cannon for the remainder of the battle. The folkloric character of Molly Pitcher is thought to be a composite of both Corbin and Hayes. Another woman who fought in the war was Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a male and enlisted in the Continental Army in 1782 under the alias of Robert Shirtleff. Sampson was wounded in the thigh during a skirmish with Loyalists in Westchester County, New York. Fearful that the Army surgeons would discover her identity, she slipped out of the field hospital and removed the bullet herself, using a penknife and sewing needle. The next summer, however, she came down with a fever, and a physician discovered her gender while treating her. Sampson was honorably discharged and went on to marry a farmer. In 1805, Congress awarded her a monthly pension for her service. Not all patriot women who aided the war effort were part of the Continental Army. Sybil Ludington, for instance, was a 16-year-old girl from New York who, on 26th of April 1777, discovered that the British were launching a raid on Danbury, Connecticut, where a stockpile of weapons was stored. Ludington leaped atop her horse and, despite a heavy rainstorm, rode 40 miles through New York's Putnam and Dutchess counties to alert the militia. Thanks to her efforts, the Patriot militia was able to drive the British back the next day at the Battle of Ridgefield. Though elements of Ludington's story have been questioned by historians, she is celebrated in American folklore as a female Paul Revere. Women behind the lines. While several women supported the war as camp followers, the vast majority remained behind the front lines as civilians. Nevertheless, many civilian women supported the war effort in any way they could. In 1780, Esther de Burt Reed, wife of the governor of Philadelphia, organized a female-run fundraiser that raised over $300,000 for the Continental Army. Additionally, the spinning bees persisted throughout the war, with women shifting their focus to making shirts and uniforms for soldiers. With their husbands gone, patriot women in several towns took to enforcing the law, exposing and punishing those who had violated boycott agreements. But most civilian women were preoccupied with running their husbands' estates and managing their affairs while the men were off at war. This granted middle and upper-class women a kind of freedom that, prior to the revolution, they could only dream of. Their husbands were often too preoccupied with their military or political work to dictate orders to their wives, leaving the women with much autonomy in regard to their homes and family finances. But of course, civilian women were not spared from the destructiveness of the war. Those who owned homes in cities that were occupied by the British Army, such as New York and Philadelphia, found themselves obliged to provide quarters for British and Hessian officers. While some officers were polite to their American benefactors, others were troublesome and rowdy. On several occasions, British and Hessian soldiers entered homes uninvited and took whatever they wanted. As in many conflicts, sexual assault was utilized as a horrific weapon of war. After their inability to catch Washington's army in the New York and New Jersey campaign, some British soldiers vented their frustrations by sexually assaulting American women in British-occupied New York City. Lord Francis Rawdon, a young British officer, expressed the frequency of such assaults in a letter, writing that, "A girl cannot step into the bushes to pluck a rose without running the most imminent risk of being ravished, and of consequence we have most entertaining courts-martial every day." Despite Lord Rawdon's distasteful attitude, the British courts-martial took acts of sexual violence more seriously and dispensed severe punishments for soldiers who were convicted. Civilian women also ran the risk of becoming collateral damage if they did not evacuate their homes during a battle. As the Battle of Connecticut Farms, 7th of June 1780, raged outside, Hannah Caldwell, the wife of the town's reverend, took shelter in her home with her children, but a stray bullet crashed through the window, killing Caldwell in front of her daughter. Civilian women, therefore, were just as affected by the war as the camp followers. Conclusion. On 31st March 1776, Abigail Smith Adams wrote a letter to her husband, John Adams, who was serving as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. "I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." These words from a future First Lady show just how much the political voice of American women had developed during the tumultuous years of revolution. Having been largely barred from political involvement since the founding of Jamestown, women suddenly found themselves thrust to the forefront of a revolutionary movement. Just like the men, women fought, bled, and died for the cause of American liberty. In the post-war United States, women were given slightly more freedoms than they had had prior to it. For instance, the need to raise virtuous citizens of a republic meant that women were more likely to receive some degree of education so that they could instruct the next generation of Americans. In New Jersey, women were also temporarily granted the right to vote, thanks to the vague wording in the state constitution. A law passed in 1807, however, ended women's right to vote in that state, and it would be many decades before women in the U.S. recovered their suffrage. Although Abigail Adams' pleas to remember the ladies largely went unheeded, the American Revolution was still an important first step in the women's rights movement in the United States. It gave American women a political voice, however limited and temporary, and lit the spark that would influence the fight for women's rights in the following centuries.